The town of Grey Ridge was the kind of place most people drove past without a second thought. Nestled in the foothills of an unremarkable mountain range, it was quiet and withdrawn, hidden behind thick trees and cloaked in a constant mist. But recently, the town had become the site of a series of disappearances that had caught the attention of a wider world, including one journalist who couldn't resist the lure of a story. Ethan Clarke sat in his car just outside the town's main square, staring at the welcome sign. "Welcome to Grey Ridge, where the mountains meet the sky." Beneath the peeling paint and faded lettering, a chill ran down his spine as he thought of the town's sudden reputation. Since arriving 3 days ago, he'd heard unsettling stories of people disappearing without a trace, leaving behind a palpable fear that seemed to hang over the place like a storm cloud. He felt the weight of that fear now, pressing against his chest. He entered the diner, a small, dimly lit place that smelled of stale coffee and frying bacon. The patrons glanced up briefly as he took a seat, their eyes dull and wary. Ethan could feel the hesitation in the air. No one wanted to talk. But he was used to small towns and their cautious ways. He'd spent the last 10 years reporting on strange happenings, digging into stories most people wouldn't believe until they saw the proof with their own eyes. Grey Ridge was different, though. He could feel the unease seeping from the townsfolk, the way they averted their eyes, the hollow way they spoke, as if some unseen presence was listening. A young waitress approached, a notepad in her hand. Her eyes were sunken, her face pale, and as she took his order, she barely made eye contact. "Anything new about the disappearances?" Ethan asked casually, his gaze fixed on her, testing her reaction. She stiffened, her eyes darting to the side as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "It's just, people have gone missing before," she murmured, "but never like this. One day they're here and the next, they're just gone. Do you know any of them?" The waitress nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she scribbled his order. "My cousin, he was only 15. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid her words might carry too far. "He left for school one morning, and by the time we realized he never got there, it was too late. We called everyone we could, the police, friends. Nothing." Ethan nodded, jotting down notes in his small leather journal, watching her from the corner of his eye. There was something else, a glimmer of understanding that crossed her face, something she wanted to say but couldn't bring herself to voice. He decided to press. Anything unusual about the way he went missing? She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the table and then back up, as if trying to decide whether he was trustworthy. Finally, she leaned in close. "You didn't hear this from me," she said in a barely audible whisper. "But some people have seen strange things, little metal boxes. They hum and they glow. No one knows what they are. They just show up in random places." "Metal boxes?" Ethan asked, his curiosity spiking. She nodded quickly, glancing nervously around. "Yeah, my cousin. He found one of them right before he disappeared. Thought it was some kind of radio, I think. Said it was cold to the touch and sort of alive." Her face tightened, her fingers gripping the notepad with white knuckles. "It's not just him. Other people who've gone missing. They all had something to do with those devices." Ethan felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, a sense that something unseen was watching him. He quickly scribbled down her words, his mind racing. These devices, he hadn't read about them in any of the police reports or statements. No one had mentioned anything about metal boxes or strange glowing lights. He felt a grim thrill course through him, the rush of a journalist on the trail of something big. After she left, he paid for his coffee and wandered through town, his gaze lingering on every shadow, every darkened window. Grey Ridge had a strange, oppressive quality, as though the air itself were thick with secrets. He walked slowly, noting the empty streets and abandoned storefronts, feeling an eerie silence settle around him. And then he saw it. Nestled in the grass along the edge of a rundown playground, partially obscured by weeds, was a metallic box. It was small, no bigger than his hand, with smooth edges and a faint, pulsing glow that seemed to breathe in and out like something alive. He approached it cautiously, crouching down to examine it. As he reached out, his fingers tingled, and a faint hum seemed to vibrate through his bones. He held his breath, his heart pounding as he hovered over the device. Was this what the waitress had mentioned? He hesitated, then brushed a finger along the surface, feeling the cold metallic smoothness beneath his skin. Suddenly, the device flickered, and he felt a jolt, a sharp electric shock that shot up his arm and left him momentarily disoriented. When he looked up, he realized the town around him seemed different. He looked at his watch. 8 a.m. again. He'd just lived the day once already, but now he was back at the same starting point, sitting on the curb, staring at the same playground. Confused, he looked around, searching for something, anything, to explain what had just happened. But the town looked exactly the same as it had that morning, as if nothing had changed at all. Was it a hallucination, a side effect of the shock? Ethan shook his head, trying to clear his mind. But then he noticed something that sent a shiver down his spine. Every face he passed, every person on the street, was now staring at him, blank and hollow-eyed, as if they could see straight into his soul. The dread he'd felt before multiplied, clawing up from his gut to the back of his throat. They weren't just staring. They were watching him, as though he were the experiment, as though they knew something he didn't. And as he looked into their eyes, he realized with sudden, chilling clarity, he was trapped here, in Grey Ridge, repeating the same day over and over, while the townsfolk, and something else hidden in the shadows, observed his every move. A spark of realization struck him. He had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding, something unnatural, something alien. Ethan knew he'd have to dig deeper to uncover the truth behind the disappearances and the strange devices scattered throughout town. But he also knew, with an unsettling certainty, that whatever was happening in Grey Ridge was only beginning. The town had secrets, and they had claimed him as their latest prisoner. Ethan woke with a start, his eyes snapping open to the familiar ceiling of his room at Grey Ridge's only inn. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with the events of the previous day. Or what felt like the previous day. He touched that strange metallic device, felt the shock, and then somehow ended up back at the start of the morning, reliving the same day as if time itself had reset. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the surreal, haunting feeling that crept under his skin. He sat up, glancing at the clock on the wall. 8 a.m., exactly as it had been yesterday. The air felt still, as if the entire town were holding its breath, waiting. He reached for his journal on the nightstand, flipping through the pages to find the notes he'd taken the previous day. But to his horror, every page was blank. He frantically flipped through the journal, his fingers trembling. But it was no use. Every trace of yesterday's events had vanished. Swallowing back his panic, Ethan forced himself to leave the inn, hoping that maybe fresh air would clear his mind. But as he walked down the same streets, seeing the same people in the same places, the truth sank in like a stone. He was living the same day again. Every sight, every sound, every detail was eerily identical. Grey Ridge had somehow looped, trapping him in an endless repetition. But today, something felt different. With each step, Ethan sensed a presence, an unshakable feeling that he was being watched. As he wandered down Main Street, he caught the briefest flash of movement from the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping behind a building, a glimmer of eyes reflecting the pale morning light. He stopped, scanning the street, but it looked as empty and desolate as it had been before. Only now he couldn't shake the prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as if something unseen was lurking just behind him. He kept walking, his steps quicker now, each footfall echoing in the silence. But everywhere he went, he sensed that presence watching, tracking his every move. It wasn't the townsfolk who seemed oblivious, caught up in their strange, repetitive lives. No. This felt alien, something colder and more calculating, observing him from the shadows with a purpose he couldn't yet understand. Then he saw them, standing in the shadows of an alley, half hidden by the dark, were two gleaming eyes. Elongated and faintly luminescent, staring at him with an intensity that sent a chill straight through him. He stumbled back, heart racing, but the eyes vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving behind only empty darkness. Ethan felt a rush of fear, his pulse pounding as he turned and walked quickly away, forcing himself not to look back. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Every corner he turned, every empty street he walked, he felt those eyes on him. By the time he reached the town square, the sensation had become unbearable, a constant pressure like a vice tightening around him. As he passed the clock tower in the square, he felt a surge of déjà vu, the same sense of foreboding he'd felt the day before, but stronger, as if the town itself were alive, aware of his every move. He glanced up and noticed, out of the corner of his eye, a shimmer of light across the way. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed on a small metallic device perched on the edge of a fountain. It looked identical to the one he'd touched yesterday, the one that had somehow reset his day. His instincts screamed at him not to touch it, but he couldn't ignore the strange compulsion that pulled him forward. It was almost as if the device was calling to him, its faint, pulsing light casting an unnatural glow in the early morning air. Cautiously, he reached out and brushed his fingers over its smooth, cold surface, and in that instant, his mind exploded with a flash of alien images, dark, grotesque forms, a distorted landscape, and a chilling vision of his own face, warped and distorted by fear. He stumbled back, gasping, his body shivering with terror. The device's glow faded, and the vision disappeared, leaving him once again in the silent town square. But now he knew. He wasn't just trapped in Grey Ridge, he was part of an experiment, a subject in some horrifying study orchestrated by, what, aliens? Some otherworldly creatures? He didn't know, but he knew they were watching, recording his every reaction. Ethan could feel their eyes on him as he made his way back to the inn. He tried to calm himself, to think logically. He needed to understand what was happening, to find a way out of this nightmare. But each attempt to gather his thoughts only led to more questions, more panic. Every face he passed seemed hollow, empty, as if the townsfolk were nothing but puppets, props in the twisted play he was now trapped in. He could see the blank stares of people on the sidewalks, their eyes following him with eerie detachment, their faces frozen in empty smiles. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, trying to piece together the fragments of his looping day. He thought of the metallic devices, the pulsing light, the vision he'd seen. Was it a warning, a message, or simply another piece of the alien's twisted study? His thoughts spiraled, each one darker and more disturbing than the last. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day in an endless loop. Just as he began to drift into a restless sleep, he felt it again, a pair of eyes watching him from the darkness. He sat up, heart pounding, and looked towards the window. And there, standing in the shadows outside, he saw them. Two elongated, gleaming eyes reflecting the moonlight like twin mirrors, staring at him with an intensity that burned into his soul. The eyes lingered for a moment, unblinking, before disappearing into the night, leaving him alone with the cold realization that he was their prisoner. He was a rat in a maze, watched and manipulated by an intelligence he couldn't begin to comprehend. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Ethan knew he couldn't stay silent, couldn't ignore the nightmare that had taken hold of his life. He would search every corner of Grey Ridge, study every metallic device he found, and confront these watchers head-on if he had to. Whatever they were, they had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. And he was determined to find a way out of this endless, haunting loop, no matter the cost. And yet, as he stood by the window, the weight of despair settled over him. Could he truly escape something that seemed woven into the very fabric of time itself? Or was he fated to live out this nightmare forever, hunted by those cold, alien eyes in the dark? Only time would tell. Time, the very force that now held him captive, looping, watching, waiting. Continuation of the story. Watch it tomorrow.